it's like what Eckhart says, and again, I don't mean to be pretentious. Like he said, you have to make a space.
I don't think you're going to be able to help it in this conversation.
Yeah, that's true. That's fair enough. He said, you have to. The goal of Rhineland mysticism was to this kind of receptivity. You have to make a space so that the Son of God can be born within you. And again, no, not being irreligious, but for me to love my partner is to cultivate that kind of receptivity, a space in which she can be within me. And I don't mean in any purely romantic metaphorical sense. What I mean is she finds a purchase within me whereby she can realize herself in both senses of the word realize. And she can come to trust that space, that place of realization will always be available for her.
Okay.
And she can come to rely on it, a place through which she can transcend herself when she needs to. I mean, and being committed to that, and finding that inseparably bound up with my own project of trying to realize who I am. That's for me the core of what it is to love somebody.
That's great. I wish you luck with it.
Well, that's all we can ever wish anybody. I mean, if you're
the grace of God.
Or that there is a life to this relationship that will eventually grow strong enough that we can come to trust in it as much as we trust in each other. And that's what I believe is happening for me. I think there's kind of three loves involved, and they're all bound up together. There's, Socratic self-love, not narcissistic self-love. There's the love of the other, and then there's the love of the relationship. But that for me is like a trinity. Talking about it as if those are separate is a mistake. You have to talk about it analytically as if they're separate, but they interpenetrate and interafford each other in a profound way. They become in an important sense indistinguishable from each other.
I've been trying to develop a counterposition to the claim that our society is predicated on the expression of power, and that our social relations are structured as a consequence of the expression of power, and therefore by inference our prime motivation is power, none of which I believe to be true. I think all of that's an aberration in the deepest sense, and I think that what we're talking about is the true path, let's say, to the degree that any of us are capable of realizing that, and I certainly don't claim to be. I struggle with it to an immense degree. But I do believe that it's the proper counterposition, and then so what do you think about that? I mean, is the culture war we're in that deep? I mean, is the counterclaim genuinely the adversarial position? I mean, what else would it be if it's not saying, it's basically saying that the claim is something like the driving force of Western culture, but I don't know how you distinguish that from the driving force of human culture exactly. I don't think most of the people who make that claim would say that there's something, it's hard for them to say that there's something radically different about Western culture and the world spirit, let's say, without only attributing all that is negative to Western culture, and that's, I think, very difficult to do. So if the mainstream of Western culture is the mainstream of human culture, or akin to it, so akin to that shamanic tradition, for example, then the claim is that mainstream is the desire for power, and that's the opposite of what we're saying, genuinely the opposite. It's the antithesis to that, because that isn't Philo-Nekia the antithesis to?
Yeah, I think it is. Well, I mean, that's part of
is it genuinely the antithesis? I mean, so is this a claim of satanic possession of the West? I mean, is the culture war that deep? Well, I don't know. I mean, the claim is that it's about fundamentals, right? It's a fundamental critique of Western society. It means fundamental. That's why Derrida went after phallogocentrism.
Yeah, and I think, and there's, and Foucault who does similar things. But the thing you have to remember is, toward the end of Derrida's career, right, he's reaching into Neoplatonic mysticism, negative theology, something he starts to take an interest in Foucault, technologies of the self, and he gets very deeply interested in the work of Pierre Hadot, right, and what is ancient philosophy and the wisdom tradition and Philia Sophia, and he starts to turn towards it and starts to recognize it as
I knew nothing of that.
Yeah, well, that's what. So I mean,
well, that's very interesting, and then he dies.
Yeah, Foucault also.
Foucault. No, Derrida. We were speaking of Derrida.
I was speaking of both. I said you see
Yes,
Foucault getting very interested in negative theology, Neoplatonic mysticism, and then you see Foucault getting very interested in Stoicism and Pierre Hadot's work on the whole Socratic tradition.
And so, what do you make? Okay, so is it reasonable for me to assume that Derrida and Foucault's thinking is at the bottom of this counterclaim that I'm discussing, which culminates in the assumption that power and is at the core of the Western endeavor, like the exercise of arbitrary power? Is that the center of the culture war? That claim?
I don't. I mean, I think that's symptomatic of something that's been going on much more deeply and much longer.
Fair enough. I don't know if that answers my question, but because I'm looking for a corrective or perhaps for agreement, but that's completely up to you. Because if it's a corrective that I need, so be it. I mean, am I taking this in the wrong direction, or am I seeing it clearly?
I want to say something other than those. I want to say that our relationship to power as a criterion of realness should be properly acknowledged rather than be made an absolute or be set up as an antithesis. I think what's coming out, I would argue, out of 4E cognitive science is the growing claim that we don't have a single way of knowing the world. We have a propositional way that, as it says, that is carried in proposition and results in beliefs. We have, which is not knowing that, but we have also procedural knowing. We know how to do things, and it doesn't result in beliefs, it results in skills. We have perspectival knowing, which is neither about belief or skills, it's about states of consciousness and how they
What's going on?
situational awareness for us. And then we have this participatory knowing.
No,
we've been
not
talking
yet.
about throughout, where I know not at the level of my beliefs or my skills or even my states of consciousness, but I know in terms of my traits of my character and how I've been shaped in order to fit the world in a way that seems to fundamentally matter to me. And I think each one of these has a different sense of realness attached to it. I think propositional has truth. I think procedural, our skills give us a sense of realness when they empower us. Our perspectival knowing, what's the sense of realness there? Well, we're getting a good sense of this from virtual reality work. It's a sense of presence, And then what's the sense of realness for participatory knowing? And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about this, like, people try to capture it with these words of faith and connection and belonging and fittedness and at one-ment. And I think instead of, I think what's happening is our culture is realizing that we have tried to reduce all the knowing, a la Descartes, to purely propositional knowing, and then we're slowly realizing the inadequacy of that. I think the fact that we are trapped in ideological battle means we think we can capture all of the meaning-making machinery at the propositional level. But what 4E cognitive science is saying is, no, you talked about tracking. The skill of tracking affords our conceptual abilities, but also states of consciousness afford us being in relationship to the world. You can have totally ineffable states that nevertheless seem the most real to you. And also these transformations of ourself also carry with them a sense of realness. And I think what's happened is the West is realizing, but in a negative way, that the propositional reduction is inadequate, insufficient, and it's groping for the closest thing at hand. And the closest thing at hand is what technology makes salient to it, which is power and control. This is Heidegger's critique. But I think we have to go deeper. We have to say, no, there's a place for that, but your skills ultimately depend on your situational awareness. And your situational awareness, the states of consciousness you get access to, ultimately depend on your character. We have to bring back that whole rich philosophical anthropology.
Why do they ultimately depend on your character? Well, that's a lot to swallow in 10 statements.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to scuttle back to my power claim momentarily and then try to wrap my head around what you said.
Okay.
Well,
sorry, I didn't mean to dump so much.
No. Well, no, not at all. I mean, it might have been the proper answer. The proper answer is often that the question isn't sophisticated enough, but it sort of throws the questioner because he's operating from within the space where that's the germane issue, right? So my claim was that the culture war right now is being fought over the claim that the fundamental animating tendency of Western civilization is the desire to exercise and the exercising of arbitrary power. And I believe that to be fundamentally wrong.
Yes.
And so I phrased it as an adversarial hypothesis, as a satanic hypothesis, essentially from a symbolic perspective, that the accusation is that the West is possessed by this satanic demand for power, and that's its characteristic spirit. And I don't believe that. I believe that its characteristic spirit is philia sophia,
yes,
fundamentally, and that is a contamination which occurs repeatedly, which would be philia Nicaea. I think if we're using your language properly, or perhaps we're slandering philia Nicaea, I mean, because I think part of the claim that you're making is that there's a positive aspect to philia Nicaea that's being damned as the mere arbitrary expression of power. Well, I do think that's something like series like Suits are getting at, right? Because you have these characters in that drama who are motivated primarily by philia Nicaea, but you see philia Sophia merge between them, and that's what makes them tolerable as characters. But both those things seem to be interrelated. One leads to the other. And that seems to be related to your wrestling argument in some sense, and maybe to mine.
Yes.
So, okay, so you think that so is your claim, let me get this right, at least in part, that,
please,
first of all, I want to know what you think of my claim about this central argument. What you're doing is saying that's a sideshow and that's a sideshow of a much deeper problem.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's quite the bloody claim, John. It's not easy for me to process, but...
Oh, that's fair.
Yeah, well, so I'm having some trouble with that, but do you think that invalidates my claim, or does it just render it irrelevant?
No, it doesn't render it irrelevant.
Given this discussion, okay, so is it okay if we deal with that and then move on?
Sure. I mean, I guess what.
Okay, am I misreading early Derrida and Foucault by attributing to them the claim that it is power that they identify as the central spirit? And am I wrong in saying that that's just a modified Marxist claim? It's a transformation of the idea of the class struggle into the domain of the sheer struggle for power?
I think you could make a claim that Foucault sees the deep interpenetration, the earlier Foucault, maybe even the middle Foucault, sees a deep interpenetration between power and knowledge. For Derrida, I do not think the difference really is a good translation, is well translated by the term power. Difference is much closer to, what I would call relevance realization, the idea that that the relevance of our claim can't be bound. I mean, somebody within classical cognitive science, computational science, Jerry Fodor makes a similar argument that the relevance of a proposition can't be captured within the syntax or semantics of the proposition. I mean, that's the main thing that Derrida is on about. So
that's a consequence of what we're bringing to the table, because the relevance is the interpenetration of the semantic and the syntactic with the unique.
The pragmatics that goes beyond it, because I mean, this is the central claim of pragmatics, that I always have to convey way more than I can say, because I have to rely on you, picking out all the possible implications, the ones that are relevant, out of all the possible.
Right, which means I have to know you, which means I have to embody whatever it is that I'm speaking to you.
Now you're back to my claim that the character traits are at the bottom of this. Right? If you
go ahead, man.
Right? If we can't actually conform at the level of our character, we can't.
Right, so that's trust.
Yeah.
And so when you trust what's honest.
Yeah.
You trust what's honest, so you trust the logos.
Right, and
because that's honesty driven by love.
Right, but I don't think.
And so if I trust you, that's what I trust. So I want to go back to something. Yeah. I asked you to define love, and I'm going to define it on my terms now, and that is the best in me serving the best in you. And I think that's the deepest pleasure That's the deepest and most lasting pleasure, and it is the most fundamental motivation. It's the inexhaustible source, because if I can do that, whenever I do that, I feel that I'm being properly.
Well,
and there's nothing better than that.
And you can extend that to the world, to situations, places.
Well, I think that's what you're supposed to do by accepting the proposition that God is love. I mean, God is love and God is logos. Those are both there. So then the question, to some degree, is the rank order of the two, and I would say God is truth within love. And that's the animating spirit of mankind. And that's a way different claim than the one the atheists are going after, by the way. Because think about it, everyone. Is truth in the service of love not the best animating spirit of mankind when it isn't pursuing an aberration? We can all ask ourselves that question.
I think that's a good question to ask.
Thank you, John.
What I mean is I think it reorients us to the
We can put that on a T-shirt. Is truth in the service of love? A good question.
I guess I see them as more. I see them as more interpenetrating. I want to make a stronger relationship between them than just a relationship of service. I mean, this is
how about her, man?
Yeah, that this is why I like the term realization. That love is a way of affording realization, and the deepest knowing you have of reality is in realization. That's what if I had to.
Okay, so it seems to me. Okay, so I'll make an appendage to my claim.
Right.
The reality that is most justifiable is brought about by the action of truth in the service of love.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm saying is I see truth. I think you're using it, and I've heard you use true as something beyond a correspondence between the semantic content of a proposition reality. I've heard you talk about right, and we even use that when we use the phrase.
Yes,
true
it seems to incorporate some of those other dimensions that you've been talking about.
Exactly.
Okay, well, great, man. So fill me in.
Well, that's what I'm trying to get at. I'm trying to get at that power is a way of when your shot is true. Your skill has been effective, and you're going to hit the mark, right? But presence is also a way in which things are true to form, right? And then the participatory knowing is when we're like the deepest sense of true, which is related to trust and being betrothed to the world in an important way. So if you'll allow me to expand what you mean by true to cover all of those dimensions.
Betrothed to the world in that you extend the same courtesy to the world that you described extending to your partner.
Exactly. I think that the answer to nihilism isn't some propositional answer. This is what I get from Nishitani.
Yeah, right.
It's to relearn, and I mean this deeply, like in the Buddhist sense of sati, to remember what it is to fall in love with reality, to fall in love with being. And if that's what you're saying is the
end, you think that's what Sam Harris is striving for in his spirituality? Well, I mean, it's not a throwaway answer. It's like, what's he up to exactly? I mean, isn't he on a Sophia, finding a Sophia adventure?
I think everybody is. How can I put this? Everybody lives from the non-propositional kinds of knowing emphasized by Plato. And that's what all of the scholastic research is pointing to now. That Socrates was trying to point people to the non-propositional knowing, the procedural, the perspectival, the participatory. I think we all have to live from that, given a lot of things I've said and a lot of things we've said.
Well, maybe you could expound on those a bit more for us and clarify that a bit more. And so you said the answer to nihilism. That isn't exactly a comment on my comment that the culture war is about the claim that the drive to power is at the core of Western being.
I think that's an equally nihilistic claim. That's my point. The claim. The
claim is nihilistic, or my claim about that is nihilistic,
the claim
or both?
That power is a fundamental reality is an attempt to assuage the wounding of nihilism, but it is fundamentally mistaken in its endeavor. it is constituted the wrong way. It's like framing a problem the wrong way, so that you do not get the insight needed to get to the solution of the problem. So I think of it as a fundamental misframing. That's what I'm trying to say. That's why I'm hesitant to say either yes or no to it, because
I get it.
Yeah.
Well, I believe that it is misframed, because I don't think it would be taking us in such a pathological direction, the whole argument.
Exactly.
If it wasn't misframed.
And so part of what I'm trying to, and for me, this dovetails with the increasing crescendo within 4E cognitive science about embodiment and embedded and extended and enacted cognition is most
right. You see this as a subset argument of one of those elements.
Yes.
But I mean, that's a huge. Like I said, I'm really having a hard time. I know what you mean, but. And I suppose what you're trying to do with everything you do is to expound upon this, but I certainly want you to expound upon this. Let's go into those three modes of alternate cognition a little bit more deeply.
Okay, so the first distinction, of course, was classically made by Ryle, and we even carry it in psychology when we make distinctions around procedural memory and things like that. This is the distinction between propositional, knowing that something is the case, in which what you're trying to do is basically assert the truth of the semantic content of a
right, and that's akin to the proposition that to believe in God is to accept a set of propositions about the nature of God. Yes, and that's what always strikes. That's why I never answer that question, because I think that's the wrong framing of the question, so I can't answer it. Okay, well, man, you're helping me out here. So because you're differentiating, you're helping me differentiate my sense of the non-propositional space. And I mean, I know some of this because I know that the knowing what and knowing how circuitry is separate.
Yeah.
I've known that since I wrote Maps of Meaning, and I know the insight circuitry is separate. And that's what I've been getting at also with regards to this idea of revelation and then critical thinking, which we started all this with and never got back to, even though it's just a trivial issue.
We're following the logos. We're following the logos in love.
Oh, God, I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so, John, because it's certainly the only justification for my existence. Red skull and all.
I think there are many reasons that justify your existence, my friend.
Yeah, well...
I think that's an inadequate self-appraisal.
Oh, thank you, John. That's vastly appreciated.
I think you would admit, and I think, there's been a growing consensus from the failure of computational cognition or even behaviorists we can't reduce consciousness.
Why failure, John?
Because what we've noticed is that consciousness doesn't seem to be something that's explicatable in terms of the logical relations between propositions.
It's not propositional.
Right,
Very good.
exactly.
Very
Okay.
good. So you
not-
think
it is not-
we've actually found that out, eh? And that's the failure. Does that mean the failure of AI as it's presently constituted?
It depends, because what's happening in AI is that AI is moving off a sort of
propositions.
The idea that cognition is computation and that the mind is a formal system is being replaced with the idea that the mind is an embodied autopoetic dynamical system, and that thinking isn't in the head, it's the way the embodied brain is dynamically coupled to the world in an ongoing evolution of your sensory motor, right?
You mean hence the justification for freedom of speech, you might say.
Well, and also the
freedom of action.
Freedom of action, and also, a freedom for people to explore different ways in which they inhabit their body. I think that's also an important thing. So I did want to get back though. So if there's a growing plausibility, so much so that, for example, Bernardo Castro, and I take him seriously. I don't agree with him, but Bernardo's a sharp guy. He proposes a kind of absolute idealism.
Who is that? I don't know him.
Bernardo Castro. So Bernardo is so convinced, and he's a very sharp guy, that the arguments of trying to reduce consciousness computationally, etc., have failed, that he is willing to advocate for, and I don't agree with him on this, but he makes a plausible case, that reality, absolute idealism, that consciousness is the ultimate reality. And whether or not that's the case, I'm making a weaker claim on the basis of that. I'm taking that as evidence that there is a growing consensus that the attempt to explain consciousness computationally, or even just in terms of behaviorist set of skills or something like that. I think that's failed. So to go back to the four kinds of knowing, you've already acknowledged the propositional.
Yeah, so, sorry, I want to interject one more thing here that's relevant to what you just said, if you don't mind.
I don't mind at all.
You know, I think the atheist critique of religion is a critique at a propositional level.
I've made this similar point, Jordan. I've made the point that they're not paying attention to. I mean, when Nietzsche runs into the marketplace, he is talking to the atheists when he says, "You don't know what you've done when you've killed God." Right? And so to think that religion is primarily about asserting propositions for which there is no evidence is to miss all of the non-proposition. So I make a distinction, and it lines up with this.
Yeah, I just happened to walk out and hear that part. So yeah, there are a lot of ways to kill God. How about lying about the Creator in thousands of different ways, 5,000 different ways to be exact, right? Wouldn't that be the same thing? So just because you have your version of it, the atheist version is just warming people up for the space alien version, right? So we don't believe in nothing until the space aliens come, kind of thing, you know? In other words, I'm kind of surprised to hear you guys even bad-mouthing it. You know, because Jordan, you talked about Darwinism, and you're all for the idea of evolution. And in the last video I did, I just talked in short lengths about it. We can see the true system. We can see the system for what it is. You refuse to look. We've all refused to look all our lives. It kind of sucks too to hear all the books come trickling down that've been written over hundreds of years, some of them thousands of years supposedly, and to see that we're still continuing those old lies as well, you know, even with the new lies here, to change things up, it just kind of blows.
On your state of consciousness. There's a knowing through consciousness, and that's what I call perspectival knowing. What consciousness does is it foregrounds some things, backgrounds others, makes things something salient. So it's doing, if you'll allow me a term I coined, it's doing salience landscaping for you. And what that does is...
Yes, is that drawing things to your attention?
Yes, drawing things to your attention.
But your attention always also does that. So is that part of that? Because you kind of choose where your attention goes.
You choose it,
but sort of, right? Or you
participate in it. You participate in attention. That's what I was saying. You don't just attend, and you don't just receive. You participate. There's both, you know, and they use these metaphors without, you know, I think, fully unpacking them. You know, there's the top down,
okay,
bottom up.
Do you think is that participatory attention akin to the dance between revelation and criticism? So is it revelation and dialogical evaluation that constitutes the participatory element of attention?
Yeah. Well, I think what it's doing is I'll speak more of the theological language. It's realizing. So there's attention, right, is doing something like prioritization, relevance realization, right, in the dialogue between imagination, where we stop thinking of imagination as just images, useless images in our head. I want to use it the way Corbin uses it, imaginal. And this is what's coming out in Friston's predictive processing. Imagination is, it permeates your perception. It's permeating your. It's right to say that I'm as much.
That's why Jung said we live to dream.
Well, but the thing that, and there's something true about that, but I want to caveat it, because people will say it's all an hallucination. No. It's not.
No, it's not.
Most of the predictions.
But that's weird. Yeah.
Most of the
predictions are accurate.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
So yeah, it can't be just a dream.
Exactly. So you've got imagination, if you'll allow me the spatial language, coming down and out. And
right,
then,
that's right, and it covers it. It covers what's out there. And we
but,
see the imagination, but it pertains to the reality.
Yes, there has to be remember we
so what we're doing is continually adjusting the
continuously adjusting the imagination. That's exactly right. So why bother with the imagination at all? Don't even bother with it. Get away from it. Atheism is just another religion. Atheism is another religion. To not believe in something because you can't see it is the claim, and because it cannot be proven is the claim. That's a psyop. That's the same psyop as the flat Earth psyop, the heliocentric psyop. Falls into the category of the space alien psyop. Because why? Because we can see it. We can see the system, the whole thing for what it is, understand it easily, appreciate it. Don't see it and then imagine that it's something else. Don't see it and use your imagination. Just see it, accept what you can see, and then keep seeing it. And as you keep seeing it, all will be explained. Not with words, not verbally, but all will be explained.
Variation on the auction side, but that doesn't mean it's random variation on the selection side, obviously. And so then the question is, what are you selected for? I imagine your wife is pretty fond of you when you manifest that. Well, yes, I have a wife too, and understand her displeasure with my multiple shortcomings, and justified displeasure, I might say. But I'm sure that she's happy when you do manifest that part of you that you said you wanted to manifest.
But I get, maybe I don't get you. What I see is you're mapping the receptivity and the selection onto sort of masculine and feminine, maybe sort of yin and yang in a Taoist thing. But if I was to respond as a Taoist, I would say, but can't I have that relationship also with you? Does it have to be necessarily embodied in a sexual difference?
I think it's also embodied in that it goes all the way to the bottom wherever you look.
Well, wouldn't that suggest then that something like the Taoist notion of yin and yang, therefore, is a more fundamental representation of the reality, precisely because it applies
to fucking eye, nose, and mouth, canine family, tell by the nose and the eyes.
I understand.
That's certainly possible. That's certainly possible. I mean,
Human this way.
I think reality
Big
is the balance of
schnoz,
good and evil
Jewish
against
looking
the background of
schnoz in
chaos
the
and
mouth
order.
right there.
So the chaos and order.
Image within image within image.
Fundamentally,
From the veil to the ground. What do we got for minutes here?
I'm just saying, I can see that in sort of, that's a very, the reason I'm saying this.
Order is the map that you're describing, right? Because insofar as it's in concordance with reality, it's a map that enables us, when we apply it, to get what we desire.
Of course.
And then disorder emerges when that prediction, it isn't just a prediction because it's predicated on desire, which is where the cognitive scientists went wrong, because it's not just expectation, it's desire.
But that's changing.
The map is motivated. Well, that's good. Be good, because that was a fundamental problem.
The predictive processing model is changing. In fact, the idea that the idea that we're even talking about something inferential, working with Bayes' proposition, is largely now moribund. Peterson himself and Andy Clark and one of my former students that I'm collaborating with, Mark Miller, and also with Brett Anderson, it's like, no, the work of Michael Anderson, the embodied understanding of predictive processing is now the dominant model in which affect, like, look, relevance realization is not cold calculation. It's
okay. So look, it's motivation and affect, let's say, but that's a hierarchical structure, and in that hierarchical structure, there's a central organizing spirit, a spirit that drives towards unity, and so because it's predicated on the very idea of the attentional focus itself, right? What do you hold in the highest esteem? That's what directs your attention, right? What you hold in the highest esteem directs your attention.
What you care about.
So how is that not a religious claim? How can that not be a religious claim if the claim is also embodied? You see what I mean?
I do think...
Because maybe there's one more step past motivation, it's personality, right? Because motivation manifests itself in personality. That's the next step for the cognitive scientists if they haven't got there yet. I mean, I knew that motivation and emotion was the step past pure expectation, because, well, Jeffrey Gray's work, which is brilliant, Neuropsychology of Anxiety, is a great book, but he assumes that the map predicts expectation, and that we're sort of cold cognitive expectors, right? Prediction machines. But we're not. We don't predict what's going to happen. We work to make what we want to happen.
Yeah,
but that's not the same thing.
But that's the change that's happening, Jordan. That they're shifting off of prediction as the primary metaphor into anticipation.
Okay, so how and is the shift gone to the point where it's personalities manifesting themselves within us that determine our direction?
Yes.
Okay,
not quite what you would call, explicit personality theory, but the notion that this is the term that's used, and of course it is fraught with millennia with issues of contention. But the idea of the discussion around the self, what the self is as an organizing principle.
It's a personality. It's a personality. Well, obviously, personality theory and cognitive theory have to be united. I mean, they're major domains, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to get a paper published that tries to integrate them. And the bridging point is actually in attention, because what's come out in predictive processing is what's called precision weighting. What you have to do is you have to privilege, because you can't model everything. They hit combinatorial explosion.
Right.
So you have to privilege.
That's chaos.
Right. You have to privilege certain predictions. We can come back later why anticipation is a much better word. And that's what attention is. And that's where the relevant...
Yes.
I'm writing a paper.
Okay, so Pajot's point would be the basis of worship is what directs attention.
And I think that's ultimately right.
Well, Jesus, that's a hell of a thing to say, because especially if the case that the apex of your attention, has this drive towards unity. And that it's based in personality. I mean, these are claims that are very much tantamount to religious claims, as far as I can see.
Well, okay, then, I have a sequence of episodes in my series where I lay out an argument step by step, trying to build the experience of sacredness and its referent. But is sacred, but trying to build the experience of sacredness out of the way in which attention and relevance realization and participatory knowing and perspectival knowing are all seeking to bind us to ourselves, the self, to each other and to the world. And the sacred is that which most powerfully and truthfully and presently and belongingly achieves that for us.
Right, great. Well said, John. Hooray. Where do you put awe and admiration in that? So think about this. Admiration is the instinct to emulate. Okay, so then we look for the most emulatable. That's the ultimate spirit.
And I think Gerard is right that always carries with it the dark side of mimetic envy and covetousness, and that those two are always playing off against each other.
Well, because we think we can possess it by ill-got means.
Yes.
That's the story of Cain.
Yes, yes.
And of course that's carried with us because the story of human history is the battle between Abel and Cain, which is also why I asked you about this fundamental cultural crisis that's tearing us apart. And was that a you said, well, that's a manifestation of deeper things, and that's what I asked too.
Yeah, and I hope that what we've been doing is actually my answer to that. Awe I can say more about because I've been involved and am involved in some actual experiments on awe and the effects on cognition and some of the work.
I don't know if what we've been doing is the answer to that or the antidote to that.
To which, sorry?
Well, if the question is posed wrong, we can't really answer it, can we? We have to provide an alternative formulation.
But that's what I think we're doing here.
Yeah, so it's an antidote rather than an answer.
And that's fine. And
yeah, I know. I'm just clarifying it.
I think looking for the answer is in some sense a fundamental way of misframing it. That is to give into the problem.
Well, how do we address it then? How do we address it, John? Do we just bystep it and just offer the alternative?
No. Think about this.
Well, no, that's a genuine question because perhaps we do just sidestep it and offer the alternative.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Sorry. I want to be more responsible. That's what I'm recommending. I'm recommending that we remember that meaning in life, and this is also something I'm doing empirical work on, right? That meaning in life is mostly bound, right, at the non-propositional level, and it does feed into things like sacredness. I think reverence is the proper virtue of awe. Reverence is the virtue that helps us appropriate.
Well, reverence means it is hold in ritual, is hold as a marker or as a pointer for ritual emulation.
I think
that's embodiment. That's the pulling in of that personality into the self.
I think that's right, but I think awe is really interesting because you can measure this. Awe is one of the few instances where people's sense of self and egocentrism is shrunk, but they find it a positive experience and they want it to continue.
Right. Well, that's how what we experience in relationship to our current ego when we hypothesize our ideal as well.
I think that's right, and that goes to.
I mean, those are the same things because awe is the ideal. Awe is our unconscious ideal capturing us. Think about it. It's the spirit within. So imagine this. You already admitted, so to speak, that we're, canonic representations of the central animating spirit of the ages. And that speaks from our unconscious because it's embodied within us, and then it finds its grip on us in awe, in admiration.
Would you say though, so there's a question, would you say that it's not only the unconscious within us, but the unconscious without us? Because I think what awe is doing is disclosing.
It's the unconscious in the books behind you.
Yes, and also the unconscious in the world. Because I think part of what we're I think we got too locked into the notion of the sacred as perfection, completion. This is one of my critiques of Plato, although I'm normally a lover of Plato. And I think you can see in the mystics and in many traditions, this is a claim I can back up, but I'm just going to throw it out there. Right? Even in Jonathan's tradition, Eastern Orthodoxy.
Is the sacred the good becoming better?
Well, the sacred is an inexhaustibleness, right?
Yes, that's why I'm asking that question.
Yes.
Because when I've had visions of heaven is a place that's perfect and getting better.
Okay, let me give you my sense, the place where I don't have visions, but the place where I experience what I'm talking about.
I wouldn't recommend them necessarily.
Yeah, well, I mean, we could compare altered states of consciousness another time, perhaps.
Yeah, okay.
By the
You'd
way-
really like to do that, would you?
Well, let me just finish the point I was making. So for me,
Go on before on to another universe, you mean?
yeah. See, for me, I tell people that Plato is sacred, which does not mean that I can't question him. It does not mean that I can't disagree with him. It means the following. Plato transforms me. I go out and live my life for a while. The world then changes me because of the way I've been changed. I come back and I see things in Plato I didn't see before. And then I go
Right.
back to the world. The thing is,
The Bible does that for people.
yes, and that's why the Bible is sacred. And what Plato, I think, argues, and what Taoism argues, and I think Christianity argues, where there's also the book of nature. There's always the two books of Revelation. You can actually experience that with respect to nature. I don't particularly like that term, but you can experience that with, right, where the world
I think
is sacred.
introverts do that in particular. That's a hypothesis of mine. I don't have evidence for it, but I've noticed my
that makes
introverted
sense.
clients need to be renewed by nature,
Yeah.
and that and it's something that seems. So if extroversion is adaptation for the social world, is it? In some sense, is it possible that introversion is adaptation for the natural world?
That strikes me as a plausible hypothesis. I mean, that strikes
Well,
me
all
as...
you introverts out there, you could tell me if you're introverted, do you find sustenance in nature differentially? Because I don't think it's true for extroverts. They want to party and be with other people.
Yeah, but there's sorry when you said all you introverts out there. I remember somebody, a former partner, she gave me
In a group, all you introverts.
yeah. That she gave me a poster. She said it was like a propaganda poster. Introverts of the world unite quietly alone in your room.
John, in my classes, I used to segregate my classes into groups based on extroversion and introversion. I asked them to, yes, because I had them debate, and so I put all the introverts together, and then they would debate, because the most extroverted would talk, right? But it worked wonderfully, and the students appreciated it. So it's something I'm humbly considering that it's something to contemplate. It worked extremely well when I had them debate, because otherwise the introverts, they're always likely to say the right thing a second later. And so they don't get to talk because the most extroverted leaps up. And that was almost always me. The most extroverted leaps up and says the thing.
That's really helpful for me, because I'm trying to understand this machinery of dialogos, and I'm trying to understand the things that come in. Obviously, there's the cognitive factors, there's attachment factors. I hadn't given enough thought to personality factors. That's good. That's very good. Thank you. That's something.
Yeah, well, I think the whole cognitive field hasn't given enough thought to personality factors because they haven't realized that motivation and affect are manifested in personality.
Well, I'm trying to
Because they
respond to
set
that.
goals, right? Well, great. I'm